Okay guys, now we're going to now look at the forces of evolution. And the first thing I want to ask is, how can a river influence the evolution of a species? So take a moment to answer that. Well, throughout this activity we are going to be answering that question, and I will get back to it at the very end. But before we jump into forces, I want to talk about the different types of natural selection that are caused. So there are 4 types. The first type is stabilizing selection. This is individuals with the middle ground or average form of a trait having the highest fitness. Now, if you remember from last week, fitness is the highest amount of offspring that survive to have their own offspring, and so on and so forth. People with higher, or organisms with higher fitness, have more children. Human birth weight is a good example of this. Infants born that are incredibly heavy or incredibly low in birth weight have a lower survival rate than those that are closer towards the mid. So the more closer towards the midline you are in terms of phenotype, the more likely you're going to survive. So the environment is going to select for the average. Second type is directional selection. This is individuals that have an extreme form. So say in a species of humans, we're all various heights from the very, very shortest to the very tall. Say that there was an environment where everything required you to be able to reach up to the highest point. Giraffes would also probably be a better example of this as well. This is just me speculating. Directional selection is going to select those with the most extreme form. So the giraffes with the longest necks, or the humans with the highest reach in that example, would survive, whereas everything below that extreme, even the average, would not fare very well. So directional selection is when you have a bunch born, but it's only selecting one specific side, one specific extreme. Disruptive selection is when both extremes are preferred. Average is bad. This is like those peppered moths we talked about last week. Now, in a forest of light-colored trees or dark-colored trees, the light moths and the dark moths are going to survive on those trees. Anything in between these two will be immediately spotted regardless of the tree type. So this is when either type can be selected for. So this is when the average is not a good thing to be. Fourth type is sexual selection, and this is an important part of the natural selection process. This is the choosing of mates. Each species has particular ways that it chooses mates. Mates are chosen based on specific traits. These traits depict healthiness and ability to produce offspring. In our culture, that has shifted over many, many generations depending on wealth, access to food, and differing areas of environments. Each species and certain subsets of species have particular things that they find attractive in a mate. As examples follow: the peacock, the deer, and the lion. Now, as you can see, the peacock, the male peacock, has to have a bright plumage of feathers to attract mates. The deer, the male, has to have a very pronounced and diversified set of antlers, and the lion's mane is its sign of health, how thick and luxurious its mane to attract females. We can also say an unofficial fifth type of selection here is artificial selection, because we do this and we cause a great deal of change ourselves. So it's not a natural sort of selection because nature is not actually doing it. Man chooses the trait that will increase the population. This is also known as selective breeding because we pick the traits we like. This is how we get the dog breeds, the livestock animals we want, the food we want, by picking and choosing in traits and forcing those organisms in that species to mate to get the results we want. Now, let's look at what causes the natural side of things. There's certain mechanisms that act on this. The first one's mutation. We've been talking about mutations all semester long. There needs to be something different in the genetic sequence of a population for natural selection to occur. The mutations are already there. It's not like a population environment is looking for that mutation. The mutation shows up. Not all mutations are bad. Some give organisms a competitor's edge. Some cause the organism to die. Some just make the organism struggle. Malaria is a great example of this. Malaria and sickle cell anemia go hand in hand. Malaria is found in certain regions of Africa and Asia and some minor parts of Europe, but predominantly Africa. Sickle cell anemia, predominantly Africa. You will find people of African descent have a higher likelihood of having sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is a very unique genetic mutation. What it does is it allows a bypass for malaria, because malaria killed a lot of people. And it really, really thinned out our populations in those countries, in that area. If you have one messed up allele, because if you remember in genetics, you have two versions of a trait. One from mom, one from dad. If you have one that has this mutation, you're going to struggle. But you are going to be immune to malaria. One version of this trait, you're immune to malaria. You're heterozygous for sickle cell anemia. This is an incomplete dominance. You're going to have some other problems, though, like getting oxygen. Athletes who have sickle cell anemia or are heterozygous for this trait have a really hard time performing well in high altitude sports arenas or fields, and they will often have to sit out on games or have to take extra time to recoup to the altitude because it's very hard on them. Because what happens in sickle cell anemia is it warps the blood cells, and the blood cells carry oxygen throughout your whole body. And if you're lacking that oxygen, you're going to have breathing issues. If you have two bad versions of the gene, two mutations of it, you have the disease, and that is not a very good livelihood. But those who are heterozygous survive. The second thing that can cause natural selection is migration, organisms going into and out of a population. This is called gene flow. Each population has its own gene pool and amount of alleles. And the gene pool is all of the genes in that population. For instance, Pennsylvania, gene pool. Virginia, gene pool. When I moved from Virginia to Pennsylvania, caused gene flow. I moved my genes from Virginia to Pennsylvania, shifting that. And then I had a child in Pennsylvania. So I caused gene flow and changed very minutely the genetics of one population to another. Genetic drift is another way. This is, and please do not get this mixed up with gene flow, this is change in alleles due to random chance. This is not natural selection, but this is a mechanism that can cause natural selection. But this is random, completely, utterly random. This changes the gene pool and how much you see the dominant and recessive alleles. There are two types. First is called bottleneck effect. This is a sharp decrease in population due to random disasters. This often wipes out equal portion of the adapted and the unadapted. This can be a tornado, an earthquake, a wildfire, anything like that that would not pick and choose what it eliminates or who it eliminates. It's like if you had to think back to our class. I know it's been a while, but think to our class. If for some crazy reason a natural disaster occurred and the only people left were people on our floor or people in the science wing, that would drastically change the gene pool of liddits or even of the school itself, because not everyone in a small group is going to be a representation of all of the different genetics and all of the amounts of different genetics in a population. So this is when a natural disaster occurs and just wipes out a good chunk of the population. And the example here, this population of beetles gets wiped out to just 2, and it shifts what you see in the future. The second one is actually very unique to this area in Lancaster County. This is founder's effect. This is when a couple of individuals leave on their own and start a new population. So a couple of them just take off and start a new population, and they become isolated. Smaller gene pool, less loss of variation, traits get repeated back and back and back into a gene pool, and rare genetic traits will begin to appear more because there's not many options in the genetic pool. The big group of interest in Lancaster County who represents founder's effect is the Amish. The Amish are actually studied because they represent founder's effect, and they're so unique genetically. A group of 100 started the entire Amish community of the US. One person in that group had a disease, and it is one of the most predominant genetic diseases in the Amish community now, and it started with just one person, and that is this Ellis-Van Creveld syndrome. In the Amish, this syndrome is displayed by extra fingers and toes, poor teeth, and dwarfism. Actually, the Amish have a higher rate of dwarfism than any other culture. It's because the genes keep going back in the population over and over and over again. So when you have founder's effect, the genes don't have a chance to swap out with others. It's the same people breeding again and again and again in the same population of the same organisms, the same families of organisms happening again and again and again. So there's no new variety unless a mutation happens. So you get traits just showing up and dominating that wouldn't be there before. Like a disease would have been potentially wiped out if there was more genetic variation. And now a disease is very prominent in this population. That is it from me, lecture-wise. We will have a few more lectures next week on patterns of evolution and speciation. But for now, this is the second lecture. You are done. And move on to the next.